Good evening, and welcome back to the Library of All Saints Cathedral for our Thursday night Lenten series on the Passion Gospels. We welcome back Bishop Miller tonight, and also tonight our special guest scholar is Woody Anderson, who is professor of Greek and New Testament at Nashotah House. He's not a stranger to the cathedral, so welcome back.
Thank you.
This evening we are looking at the Passion narrative in the Gospel of Mark. And again, we also thank the Living Church for allowing us to tap into their internet with their nice high-speed upload. And in the studio audience here this evening is Christopher Wells, the publisher of the Living Church and chairman of the board of the foundation. And he'll be with us in a couple weeks also as a guest scholar. So without further ado, I will turn the discussion over to Professor Anderson and Bishop Miller.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you very much. Woody, thank you for being here. Professor Anderson, Woody Anderson, is a member of Zion Church in Econowalk in this diocese and on the faculty at Nashotah House, the Theological Seminary, which is here within the boundaries of the diocese. And we're delighted that he is with us and for his work and membership in our community. Remember last week we talked about how the gospel, the Passion narratives are can take place in 4 acts, and we provided for you an outline that's available on the website, and that those 4 acts are: Jesus prays and is arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. Act 2, Jesus is before the Jewish authorities. Act 3, Jesus is before Pilate. And then Act 4, Jesus is crucified, dies, and is buried nearby. And so what we're going to do tonight is just go over what happens in each of those acts. Is I know that all of you have done your homework, or that some of you have done your homework. I'm going to assume that all of you have done your homework. That's called grace, I suppose. And questions as we go along, either in our studio audience, as we say, or if you're out there in cyberspace, or email, Facebook a question. Kevin is paying attention to that, and my Twitter account is not up and running this evening. I apologize for that. So we begin in the Passion narrative in Mark begins with verse 32 of chapter 14. Immediately before this, Jesus has predicted the path and told Peter that before the cock crows, Peter will times. And says to Jesus in response, even though I must die with you, I will not deny you. And it reports that all of the disciples said the same. So now we'll see what happens with those bold statements and go forward. So in chapter 32, we read that they went to a place called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to his disciples, sit here while I pray. He took with him Peter, James, and John, and began to be distressed and agitated. I think it's important to note that the saying of Peter, James, and John remind you that there's 3 people, and these are the same 3 who went with Jesus to the Mount of Transfiguration. I think that's significant, Woody. Would you agree? And
it's one of those things that's significant, but I don't know why.
Okay.
Well, Peter, James, and John function as an inner circle. Somewhere Andrew gets lost in this gospel until a little bit down the road, but those 3 seem to function like an inner circle with Jesus, and they are privy to certain interior experience within the circle of the disciples. And the Garden of Gethsemane, like the Transfiguration, is one of those special moments that they are privileged to be a part of.
Yeah. I think it's important to also note the 3ness of this, and we'll get to that in just a moment, because we have the first of the triads that then come up in this next section of the gospel, that Peter and John and James go away, and Jesus goes off to pray and goes off 3 times, and 3 times comes back and finds Peter, James, and John sleeping. And what's the significance of, is there any significance of the number 3 in all this? It's not like 7 instituting completeness or the divine. Well, where does 3 end up in biblical numerology?
the problem with numerology is not that there aren't answers to such questions, but there are too many answers.
All right.
And sometimes we're left to speculate why 3. I think that the 3s in the Passion narrative probably have, and you're welcome to disagree with me, and I'll yield, but I think they probably have less to do with symbolic significance than they have to do with culpability.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, a single denial, say by Peter, would be one thing.
Right.
But to keep repeating the same mistake after having been warned and then, told, prophesy that you'll do this,
Mm-hmm.
the sort of the wretchedness of his weakness of the flesh.
Yeah.
And the same weakness of the flesh is evident in these 3 here,
Mm-hmm.
as they're told to watch and pray and not give way. They're not to give way to temptation.
Right.
And I think for us, when we hear don't give way to temptation, lest you give way to temptation, we tend to think of this temptation business as a kind of enticement to seduction towards sin or something like that. But the temptation for them is a testing to be brave and courageous at this moment in kind of crisis moment in Jesus' life.
Mm-hmm.
And that they fall asleep when they've been called to be watchful is a kind of a metaphor
Mm-hmm.
for this lack of spiritual resolve on their part.
Yeah.
And that it happens 3 times, like Peter's 3. I don't know if it's so much of a symbol as a kind of a statement of the depth of weakness,
Mm-hmm.
the extent of weakness on both of their parts.
Yeah, it certainly keeps on going, and I think it says to us the surety that this really happened.
Yeah.
It wasn't just a one-shot deal, where everybody makes a mistake, but it's sort of a 1, 2, 3 strikes you're out, for lack of a better.
I think it's a testimony to the complete abandonment that Jesus experiences.
Right.
Right. Here are the people that at the crisis moment, his crisis moment, that even if they can't do anything about it, they're at least supposed to be there for him.
Right.
And they keep not being there. And then, of course, sandwiched between Jesus' trials, between the Sanhedrin and then Pilate, is Peter's abandonment,
right,
of Jesus, and just showing the kind of utter desolation
mm-hmm.
from those from whom we would expect better.
Right. And we'll get to that in just a minute. That's okay. So Peter, James, and John, as you see, have gone off. They fall asleep 3 times. I think it's important for us to pay attention to what Jesus says, because Jesus also prays 3 times. The first time he goes off and he prays, "I'm deeply grieved even to death. Remain here and keep awake." Jesus comes and prays and says, "Father, if all things are possible for you, remove this cup from me, yet not what I want, but you want." And then Jesus comes and finds them sleeping and utters that line, "The spirit is indeed willing, but the flesh is weak." And then he goes and prays and finds them sleeping again, and goes and prays and finds them sleeping again. And after that, he says, "Are you still sleeping, still taking your rest? Enough. The hour is come, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." And so we kind of the completion of that desolation, and certainly that resolve being washed away that you mentioned, I think is really indeed the case. And then, of course, we have the arrest of Jesus, and what strikes me in this section where Jesus of the arrest of Jesus is the approach of Judas, the one, "I will kiss," is the man, arrest him and lead him away under guard. And so Judas comes up and kissed him, and then those laid hands on him and arrested him. And then verse 47, "But one of those who stood near drew his sword and struck the slave of the high priest, cutting off his ear." And what I find interesting in that, and what struck me as I read that, particularly in preparation for this class, is that it doesn't say who did it. Was it one of Jesus's followers? Was it just some guards getting a little rowdy, and in that melee that was happening, so he could have been struck by one of his own? It doesn't say who struck that, and there's really no saying. And because it doesn't say in this gospel that the disciples are armed when they go to the garden, as it does in another gospel. And I wondered that because Jesus says, "Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me as though I were a bandit? Day after day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not arrest me. But let the scriptures be fulfilled."
Yeah, I think what we're seeing there is that Jesus is drawing a kind of an ironic attention to the fact that with his entry into Jerusalem and his teaching in the temple courts, he's been plain. The text even tells us that he began to speak plainly about himself. And so the fact that they're coming out to him and treating him as a political subversive is contrary to the way that he has self-presented himself.
Right.
So they are both wrong and right about Jesus. He is subversive, but he's not a bandit, a laissez, kind of a social bandit of the sort that would be like deliberately antithetical to Roman rule as such. It's just that if people listen to him and start following what he's actually saying, that'll mean something political for the Roman overlords.
Right.
And so they're right to be afraid of him, but this text is trying to draw attention to the sort of overkill misunderstanding of the kind of subversiveness I think that Jesus represents.
Right, right. And why do you think Mark would want to particularly pull that out?
Well, I mean, for one thing, most scholars, when they think about the Gospel of Mark, are thinking about a Christian community that's under some duress. And the political circumstance, in my view, in the late 60s, is a possible, a good, likely date for this Gospel. The political circumstances would be such that to remain watchful and faithful, like the three disciples who weren't, would be incumbent upon the Christian community who were facing, at the very least, social ostracism, but probably for the first time in primitive Christian history, facing actually formal persecution from the state.
Right, yes.
And so the fact that Jesus had a kingdom that was not of this world and yet subverted the kingdoms of this world is pretty significant for that community.
Sure, and that paints the way that also that Jesus is portrayed in this gospel as someone who is completely misunderstood all the time, and no one really knows who Jesus is.
That's right.
And the disciples more and more don't quite get what Jesus is about. And that paints a picture that may be describing
That's right.
the people that Mark is speaking to and preaching to, and reminding them of that.
That's right. And I don't think it would just be Mark's gospel, but it's true of Mark's gospel, is that Jesus is presented as innocent, but not dangerous. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Dangerous, but not in the normal ways.
Right.
Right. So they're wrong to call him a laissez, but they're right to see that he's a troublemaker. But he's a certain kind of troublemaker.
Right. Yeah. Which is perhaps the good kind of troublemaker for you and me.
Well,
that's or at least
we stand to make more trouble, but of the Jesus kind.
Yes, that's true. Exactly. The other thing that's interesting and that Mark alone records is in verses 51 and 52, a certain young man was following him, and wearing nothing but a linen cloth, they caught hold of him, but he left the linen cloth and ran off naked. And for a while it was popular that some scholars would say, well, that was Mark's signature in the painting, although a lot of early Christian writers say, no, Mark never knew Jesus, but he was a disciple of Peter's community and therefore had heard this. So do you have any thoughts on that comment?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts and no conclusions. I think the one thing that biblical scholarship is sure about is that we don't know what those verses are there for.
Right.
That we're
exactly.
Sure of that.
We're sure of that.
I haven't myself abandoned the idea that this is a Markan signature.
Okay.
You know, the sort of the classic model for this is, or analogy, is it's kind of like Alfred Hitchcock making an appearance in his films. And I don't know if that's true, but I would like it to be.
Sure.
if that counts for anything.
Right.
There doesn't seem to be, even though there have been other proposals, there doesn't seem to be a better proposal for why this two verses and this young man find themselves in the gospel. Now, you may know, and I don't want to take us down a rabbit trail, you may know that there is a so-called secret gospel of Mark that is either a forgery or an amazing happenstance in the middle of the 20th century.
Right.
And it was discovered by, or written, as the case may be. I think probably written, forged by Morton Smith. And we find a segment of the Gospel of Mark that would follow Mark 10:32, according to Morton Smith. And it tells us more about this young man.
Okay.
All right. So I'm not persuaded of its authenticity. Not much of modern scholarship is persuaded of its authenticity. Art Ehrman is not persuaded of its authenticity, so we don't have many people that want to make the case. But I think it was a nice little invention by Morton Smith that got people talking.
I see. Well, that's interesting. Go ahead.
I forgot to lift it up.
That's
All right.
we'll all be lifted up at some point. At the end of Mark's gospel, when the women, or when they come to the tomb, the person they see is described as a young man dressed in white. Is there any thought that might be the same young man, or some kind of foreshadowing using that same terminology between the young man who fled and then the young man who claims the risen Christ?
Right, that's one of the possibilities out there. Working against that possibility is that the actual verbal overlap in the Greek is quite minimal. So I guess what I would say is that if Mark had wanted to send that signal clearly, he had some opportunity to make it more clear. And it's not beyond Mark to make himself and his connections a little more clear. But that is definitely one of the possibilities that's out there.
That was a hypothesis of one of your predecessors at Nashotah, Father David Deco.
Oh, okay.
My Greek teacher always.
Okay.
That was one of his. One of the themes that he hit on regularly.
Yeah.
No, interesting.
Well, I certainly can't be ruled out. The actual reference, the way the garments are described, have no particular parallels, but that doesn't mean it's impossible.
Or if there was a connection, perhaps it was also the symbolicness of the person being naked before baptism and clothed after their baptism, and another possibility there is part of the baptismal.
That's another theory.
Being baptized into Jesus' death and resurrection. But
One of the things I always do when a clergyman asks me proposes one of these kinds of theories is I need to ask first, have you preached this? Because I want to know if you have skin in the game, right? Anyway, okay, yeah. So I don't know that we know, but that may be as good as anything else. I actually, even though what we can know about the possible author of the Gospel of Mark does not exclude the fact that he could have been an erstwhile observer or participant in Jesus' Jerusalem experience. Now, the other thing is that at a narrative level, his fleeing is just one more abandonment after the disciples are scatter. And so now there's yet one more that scatters. And so it makes a kind of sense that the author of the gospel might number himself with those who fled.
yeah, that's very true. That's interesting. Like the line in that hymn we sing on Good Friday, who was the guilty, who brought this upon thee? Alas, my treason, Jesus hath undone thee. 'Twas I, Lord Jesus, I was denied thee, I crucified thee. Yeah, I think that's.
And of course, if we follow the tradition of the earliest tradition in the composition of the Gospel of Mark would be from Papias, the Bishop of Hierapolis, who claims that Mark, the author of the Gospel, derives his writings from the oratory of Peter and from Peter's eyewitness. And thus, he would be numbering himself in this case as one rather like Peter, his mentor. And that makes a certain kind of sense as well.
Yeah.
And I think that although there are reasons sometimes for doubting the legendary arguments for the authorship of certain gospels or the circumstances of their origination, this particular one bears a lot of verisimilitude, I think, precisely because the Gospel of Mark frequently represents Peter and his apostolic friends in less than flattering terms.
Mhm.
And one of the ways to account for that is the fact that, well, Peter was telling tales on himself,
Right.
whereas 3-4 decades after the fact, when the apostles began to be esteemed as the first
Mhm.
generation foundation and pillars of the church, it would have been, I think, a dicier proposition to start making them look as dull and as lacking courage as they do in the gospel.
Mhm.
So I don't think that tradition is improbable, and thus, if it's a signature of John Mark, that could make a certain kind of sense.
Yeah, and it certainly says something about the veracity of what they're saying, because who would paint themselves in a bad light if they weren't doing that? The church's recovery community, where we admit that we're powerless over sin and lives become unmanageable, and then what does that look like? And if you've ever been to a 12-step meeting, a lot of people have to tell their story, but thanks be to God, I'm sober today, and
Well,
that's the
that's
same
right.
kind of thing. Yeah.
Well, and it points out to us that, which I think is important, James, John, and Peter failed Jesus. Peter denies Jesus. He fails him sort of triply,
Mm-hmm.
but they do not go the way of Judas.
Yeah.
So in the grace of God,
Yeah.
there can be a pretty miserable performance of faithfulness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And yet the grace of God is to restore people.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
To restore all but those who refuse to be restored.
Mm-hmm. Very true. So that leads us then to that act, which certainly made that happen. We're now in the section of Act 2 of Jesus before the Jewish authorities, and what leapt out at me as I read this section tonight is the sense of the false witnesses, but the testimony didn't agree, and Mark repeats that phrase, their testimony didn't agree, twice. And that, so there's a clear sense that these people they're saying all these things about Jesus, but they can't even agree that he said he would destroy the temple made with hands and in 3 days build another. And then even on this, their testimony didn't agree. And so the high priest stands up and says, "Have you no answer? What is it that they testify against you?" But Jesus was silent and did not answer. And then there's this interchange between Jesus and the high priest, who is not named, but "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" And instead of not giving an answer, which happens in some other Gospels, Jesus is pretty clear here. "I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, and with the coming of clouds of heaven." And then the high priest tears his clothes and says, "This is blasphemy," and they condemn him, deserving death.
Do you know why they called that a blasphemy?
That would be a helpful thing to...
Because it was.
Yeah, right.
That's why they call it. That's why he thought it was a
Blasphemy, right, because it was.
This is either true or it is a blasphemy.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, there aren't really a lot of gradated choices in between. Now, of course, what Jesus is doing there is there are two really important Old Testament echoes in his answer. And as you say, it's typical in the Gospel of Mark that Jesus shrouds his identity. It's often been known as the messianic secret in the Gospel.
Right. Yes.
That's over now.
Right.
And when he asks, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" There's an answer there that has an echo to the Old Testament, which in Greek is ego eimi. I am.
I am.
Now, ego eimi can just mean yes, it is I. Right. It can just mean that. But it's hard not to see in the rending of the garments and the charge of blasphemy that Jesus is making, especially in light of the larger gospel, Jesus is making a claim larger than just, "I'm your guy."
Right.
And then he says beyond that, and then he cites Daniel 7:13. And in Daniel 7:13, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power. I don't think it means here coming with the clouds of heaven, but going on the clouds of heaven. In other words, Jesus is referring to his exaltation that's to come, because that's the figure of the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the Ancient of Days in Daniel 7:13. Not a coming to earth, but a going from into exaltation. So Jesus is leaving no reserve at this point, and that's why I say the reason they called it blasphemy is because
it was,
it was,
in their
unless
minds.
it was
It's true. Right. Yes.
Right.
Exactly. Right.
Sometimes things are, white and black.
Exactly. So then we have, so we come to that, and then we come to, after that happens, then we hear the denial of Peter. Then we have the denial of Peter, and we've talked a little bit about that it happens 3 times before the cock crows in fulfillment of what Jesus said to Peter. It that the 3 times shows kind of just the whole utter kind of desolation, and I don't think anybody can read that passage without having a certain set of empathy for Peter, knowing how, if you've ever been a little kid on a playground and been picked on or whatever, that kind of being bullied, that sense of what was going on with Peter. Yet even in the midst of that, he breaks down, and that pride that Peter, the bravado at the beginning, now to this utter desolation is I think a real powerful piece.
I especially like your last point that Peter, all the way through this gospel, and it's true in all the synoptic gospels, but Mark's portrayal of Peter is more concentrated. He is always the quickest to speak, the spokesperson. The bravado is the right word.
Mm-hmm.
Right? He says what other people are thinking and unashamed.
Yeah.
And now here's Peter brought to nothing, with no courage. And in a literary way, Mark has positioned Peter's denial between Jesus' trials.
Mm-hmm.
So we actually have 2 trials of Jesus, but we have 3 consecutive trials.
Mm-hmm.
Right? There's the Sanhedrin, there's Pilate, but in between that, Peter himself is on trial.
Yeah.
Peter is set to the test,
Mm-hmm.
and his test is informal, but as Jesus boldly confesses, "Ego eimi," the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand, and so on. Peter shrinks back
and says, "I am not."
And says, "I am not." That's very good.
Yeah, that's very that's so it's not ego eimi, but the exact opposite. I think that's an important piece for us to remember. I also the other thing I like about this bravado piece of Peter, which begins in the whole gospel, which begins always Peter is the one that's making the bold statement, "Let us build 3 booths," all that sort of stuff. Is that
There's another 3? Right?
Right, exactly. There's that question of, I'm having a hard time coming up with the word, but I think that the sense of the messianic secret talk of theory that you never really understand who Jesus is until you see him crucified. And so Peter has to get rid of all that stuff to really eventually see who Jesus is, just as the Roman centurion proclaims, but again, we're leaping ahead. So let's move on then and talk a little bit about Jesus before Pilate. And so Jesus is before Pilate, and again he answered. Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And there's no messing around. It's a direct answer again. "You say so." Now, there's a whole lot of ways to read that "you say so." One would be to say, well, that's what you're saying about me, but I'm something more. But there's also might be the sense of saying, yes, you say so, and yeah, that's who I am. There's kind of a mystery in that, I find sometimes. I'm never quite sure how to read that passage.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure that I know, but I would make this proposal that the Passion narrative is frequently operating at the level of both verbal, dramatic, and even circumstantial irony.
Mm-hmm.
So that people end up saying things that are true of Jesus that they don't understand the nature in which it's true.
Mm-hmm.
It's more true than they know, or true in a way that's different than they would have understood.
Mm-hmm.
So when he says, "You are the king of the Jews," and Jesus said, "You have said it," that's certainly not a denial.
Mm-hmm.
But it is also Jesus not willing to accept the definition offered of what it might mean to be the King of the Jews.
Right.
So is he the Messiah? Yes, but he's been redefining messiahship all the way through.
Sure.
So Jesus doesn't want to say what you think it means to be King of the Jews is what I'm claiming about myself.
Right.
Right. I am.
Mhm,
right.
yeah.
I am King of the Jews. But as you say, more than that, and by my own definition.
Sure.
Right. So I think that's the reason for the ambiguity there. He's not willing to let somebody else's definition sort of hold sway.
So it's, in one sense, it's not like that Pauline, we see through a glass darkly, that they're getting close,
Yeah.
but they're not quite there yet.
Yeah.
Which, Kevin?
And if he would have come out directly and said, I'm the King of the Jews, that would have given Pilate recourse to actually crucify him
Sure.
on its merits.
Right.
And Jesus really never gave him the opportunity to do that, and that's part of the story.
Right. And we certainly get to that as we go into the next section, where Pilate hands Jesus over to be crucified, and there's this mention of a custom at the festival. He used to release a prisoner for them, anyone whom they asked. And some of the scholarship that I've been reading says that, that's not a Hebrew custom, that's a Roman custom that happened in certain places, and so there's something that may be imported by the Roman government to Palestine under the rule of, or the governorship of Pilate, but not a common thing that happened in it. This isn't a scapegoating kind of thing or a once a year. And so the crowd came and Pilate began and they asked Pilate to do for them according to his custom. And so he asked who they want to release, and because Pilate, it says that Pilate realized it was out of jealousy that the chief priest had handed him over. They were jealous of the following that Jesus had, that they were jealous of the position that Jesus had. And so, but according to this telling a story, it's the chief priest who stirred up the crowd for Pilate to release Barabbas. And then the question, what do you want me to do with him? And the cry, crucify him, crucify him.
Yeah, this Pilate episode is touchy, and maybe not everybody feels this, but maybe you will when I'm done. The reason it feels touchy is because here's a Roman procurator who is getting away with, it seems, claiming innocence. And foisting responsibility for the crucifixion of Jesus on Jewish leadership. So Rome, it seems, is washing its hands.
Yes.
But again, this is where I think Mark wants us to see the irony. Pilate can't wash his hands. This is his responsibility. He is exhibiting the kind of lack of courage that was foreshadowed, say, in Mark chapter 6, when Herod has Jesus beheaded.
John the Baptist beheaded.
Yeah, excuse me. John the Baptist. Yeah, that would have changed the story.
A lot, yeah.
Quite a bit, right? Thank you. That's a pretty important correction. And so what you see here is that you actually see in Pilate not a virtuous man, but a weak-willed man who has his finger to the wind politically, and say, well, look, what works for me is to keep Jewish unrest at bay. And I'm not a man of principle. I don't care about this stuff. If I can get something by releasing Barabbas and with the crucifixion of Jesus, that's fine with me. But as readers, we are not, as actually some Christian readers have done through the years, to exonerate Pilate so as to place full blame for the crucifixion of Jesus on Jewish leadership. That actually has contributed to a regrettable anti-Semitism,
right? Yes.
And that, I think it's not only regrettable, but I think it's a misreading of the text. Pilate's his own weak-willed political opportunist,
right?
And there's no virtue, despite his protestations to the contrary.
Right, and certainly, I think if we picture the scene, Pilate would have been aware and had his handlers around him. So he may have even known that people were going to cry for Jesus to be crucified, and that the crowd had been stirred up. So it was an attempt to look gracious, even in the midst of that too.
That's right.
So it's I think it's a pretty dicey scene.
It can. I say it's dicey only because of the way that some interpretation,
Right.
the direction is taken it. I like to think that one great kind of enduring justice is that in the creed, Jesus suffered under Pontius Pilate.
Yes.
And that we never forget that.
That's right. Yeah, that's very true.
And I don't mean that to single out Pontius Pilate as a man, but he suffered under the Jewish, the overlords of the Jews.
Yes.
Right. And we don't forget that.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't forget that he was a victim of political opportunists.
Yes. Yes. That's very true. Some scholars have said that one of the reasons some authors, gospel authors, they've asserted that that the reason that Pilate looks less culpable is that they're trying to show to the Roman authorities at the time when they were being persecuted, see, we're not anti-Roman.
Yeah, and that's a theme, I think, which I'll defer to our Luke guest.
Okay.
That's a theme, I think, that's a little more worked out in Luke Acts.
Yes, right.
And I suppose that's possible. I guess my take on that would be that Mark might have some of the seeds
Mm-hmm.
that Luke uses and can develop in that direction. But even then, I think that Pilate is an ironic witness to the innocence of Jesus, not to his own self-defense or his own innocence.
Yeah.
It's about the innocence of Jesus, which is to say, the sheer injustice that his crucifixion entails. I think that's the bigger theme. But Luke does, in a variety of ways, including into the book of Acts, show that this early Christian movement, subversive though it was not a political threat in the normal sense.
Right, right, right. Okay. Thank you. Well, let's move on. And so we've had the trial before Pilate, and we've had the we've had the trial before Pilate, and now we're in the mocking of Jesus, and where they place a crown on him, and a purple cloak and some thorns into a crown. They put it on him, and they begin to salute him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They strike his head with a reed, spit upon him, kneel down in homage, etc., etc. What leapt out for me this time was I had read before that the reed was supposed to symbolize a royal scepter, and yet there's no mention of Jesus holding this reed, but rather them taking a reed and just hitting him with it.
I claim ignorance.
Okay.
I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
I mean, I haven't known most of what I've said so far tonight, but this one I really don't know.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I mean,
there is the purple robe, but like you say,
right.
They haven't made him hold the scepter, have they?
No, they haven't.
There's no indication
of that. Right, yes, right, okay.
But this passage is maybe our best example of the whole Passion narrative, of how Mark likes to use irony again.
Mm-hmm.
They pay homage to him. They declare him King of the Jews. They kneel before him, and they don't obviously know what they're doing.
Right.
They're paying homage to one to whom homage is due.
Yes, right, precisely.
Yeah.
Precisely. Yeah. That'll preach, as they say in the phrase. I think that irony piece is really good and is really helpful, I think, in understanding what Mark's getting at here. And then, of course, we have Jesus is the compel a passerby who's coming into the country to carry the cross, Simon of Cyrene. I think most of us, because we've seen television movies, so often think of Jesus carrying the whole cross, but usually at these Roman crucifying places, there was a pole that was always there, and people just carried the cross piece.
That's my understanding.
And some people have commented that Simon, and I think it's only Mark who mentions the father of Alexander and Rufus. I'm trying to remember that, but I think that's true.
No, I think that's right.
That this may have been something that was really known to the Markan community. It may have very much been been a piece of that. You know, this really happened, and this really happened because these guys' dads did it, and so Alexander and Rufus certainly may have been a part of the Markan community.
Yeah, that I think that is precisely the point. If you have a head for details and close textual scholarship, the book, it's about 10 years old now, by Richard Balcom, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. He does a painstaking study of named characters in the Gospels. That's at least one leg of his argument. And his argument is that these Gospels were written to 2 people and 4 people who actually knew these named characters.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So there was a kind of a control, is what you're suggesting, a historical control, that this actually happened.
Right.
This is historical stuff.
And that's important in a culture where there were a whole lot of salvation myths out there that had no basis in history.
That's right, and didn't require history to be true in their own sense.
Right, yes, but because in Judaism and thus in Christianity, God is the God who intervenes in real time in human history. This is one of the ways in which they help to make that case.
Yes, that's right.
Yes, right. So Simon, so the cross is carried by Simon of Cyrene. They take Jesus to the cross. His garments are divided among the crucifiers, and we know that's an allusion to Psalm 22. They divided my garments among them. It's interesting that all the gospel writers, all the synoptics and John, all make real mention of this. Some going into more elaborate stories. And then we have the actual crucifixion itself. Jesus with a charge above him, the King of the Jews. The 2 bandits, one on his right, one on his left. Those who should be paying him homage, again mocking him and inviting him to come down from the cross. The chief priests are mocking him. He saved himself. He cannot save others. That the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down from the cross. And even those crucified with him taunted him, joined in the taunting. There's no good thief not in Mark at all. So that's I think an important thing to remember as we put this crucifixion scene together, that the Jesus that Mark paints is getting it from everybody, from his inner circle, from all the authorities, and even the criminals there.
Yeah, I mean, even people that sort of have a reason to be in the circumstance they're in, they mock and deride him. You know, so it's full on. It might be important to point out that our translations tell us that on either side he's surrounded by 2 robbers, thieves, and but it would be, I think, useful to point out that the word there isn't so much a reference to a common criminal, a shoplifter, or something like that. A leistes would have been a social bandit. Is the current terminology, and the point is that these, like this was a kind of a form of social protest. So these would have been people that, like the Sicarii, who were sort of first century terrorists in the middle of a crowd, would slice you open in your belly, and you wouldn't know what happened. Mm-hmm. These were people that were upsetting the social fabric. They were non-beneficent Robin Hoods.
Okay.
All right. And so they're trying to provoke social change, but largely by protest actions.
Okay.
And upsetting the social fabric. They were political revolutionaries, mm-hmm. but they're the kind of political revolutionaries that you find in a minority population that doesn't have the kind of power or military might to do a full-on onslaught. So when Jesus is surrounded by robbers, he's actually surrounded by the kind of insurrectionists that he's being accused of being.
Right.
And which he's not.
The NIV calls them rebels.
Rebels is good. That'd be a good translation.
Seems like a better translation.
Yeah, it's better than robbers. I mean, I don't doubt that they might have stole something, but it's not actually the point. No,
the point is that these people are accused of what Jesus has been accused of, and yet even they don't see him as a part of their movement and a part of what they're doing. So it also is kind of highlighting again, too, the difference of Jesus' subversiveness.
That's right.
for lack of a better word.
That's right. From their perspective, for Jesus to have the placard "King of the Jews" is their response is, if only.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
We don't have a king, and you're just you're a sorry excuse.
Right. Yeah. Indeed. So then Mark tells us the death of Jesus, that this occurs around noon, and we hear him cry out with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? The beginning of Psalm 22. And some bystanders heard it, and they said, listen, he is calling Elijah. So some didn't know what he was saying. Was there a kind of anything in Jewish worship where at the time of death people would recite psalms the way we in our death try and recite on the death people might say the Lord's Prayer or the Creed? Is there anything like that going on in this, or is this simply more of a meant to be a fulfillment of Scripture thing?
Well, that's a pretty interesting question, and I'm not able to speak authoritatively to that. The analogy that I think of, the most likely analogy, is that we have a testament genre in Second Temple Judaism, and the testament was sort of a deathbed speech that a major figure, always pseudepigraphical, not written or given by the actual person, but in an idealized world, what this Jewish figure should have said, right, to his children and about the legacy that he was leaving behind. And these are always very composed people who accept their death with equanimity. And so I don't know, or I can't think of a comparable sort of cry of desolation. Right. That seems to be sort of counter. Of course, circumstances in the Testament are nothing like a crucifixion. So, so I don't find any fault, but this seems to be an unusual thing. But you asked the question about the use of Scripture, intuitive, maybe from memory use of Scripture. I don't know the answer to that, but I can't imagine that they didn't. Right. Given the way that important scriptures were set to memory and so on, and form the fabric of life and thinking.
Well, one of the reasons I asked that is because we all know Psalm 22 from Palm Sunday and from Good Friday, and yet we also know that it ends on a much more hopeful note. And so one wonders about Jesus's, and at least I wonder about Jesus's attitude on the cross, and is this him beginning to experience both the desolation on the cross, but also a reaffirmation of his relationship with the Father. There's a part of me that wants to see that, that confidence in him. Although it could, but others would say that the desolation itself was so important.
Well, we're in the middle of a little kind of a argument that's been going on in New Testament studies for some time. And the gist of the argument is, when you see a citation of an Old Testament text, are you to infer from that citation the whole larger context, so that when Jesus says, my God, why hast thou forsaken me, we get to go to the end of Psalm 22 and to see that God will set his suffering righteous one to rights and such. And a lot of people want to say that. And sometimes it seems that that's exactly right. And yet it's hard in this context, I think. Well, let me say it this way. I would be wary of underplaying the very real experience of abandonment and desolation that Jesus is experiencing in faithfulness to the Father. I mean, remember that when Jesus has been preparing for us, and Mark preparing the reader for this event, he's told us that the Son of Man will give his life as a ransom for many. Jesus has said, take this cup from me. Now, other Jewish martyrs, and Christian martyrs even more, exercised a lot more courage and equanimity in facing even violent deaths. And now here's Jesus. He didn't seem nearly as courageous as those folks. And is Jesus more honest? Is that all? Or is there something that Jesus understands about the nature of his death that would be unlike any other human death.
Mm-hmm.
And now, I don't follow people who want to talk about a rupture in the triune God, or they use words like separation. That's interposing a kind of theological, metaphysical problem where it doesn't need to be. Nonetheless, if Jesus said, "Take this cup from me," the only cup that Jesus can be referring to is the cup dozens of times in the Old Testament that bears the wrath of God,
Yes.
where Jesus is talking about a judgment that he will experience.
Right.
And so for Jesus to say, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" I think is for him to say speak more about more than just his feelings.
Yeah.
But actually to be experiencing the forsakenness in bearing in his body and absorbing into his person the sin of the world.
Right. And certainly that plays with how forsaken Jesus is throughout this passion narrative by his closest friends, even then to feel that from his very own Father.
That's right. And if as we do read the Psalms regularly, this is the psalmist's righteous frequent complaint.
Yes.
That when trouble befalls me, all my friends leave.
Right. Yeah.
Right. I'm alone, and then people mock me. They make sport of me, and I'm just trying to be faithful to God.
Yeah.
So I think that in theological, larger scale theological reflection, and because we believe in the resurrection, we can affirm the affirmative note at the end of Psalm 22, but I wouldn't affirm that at the expense of the actual desolation and forsakenness that the cry of dereliction kind of screams out.
Yeah, I think right, sure, yes.
We have 9 minutes to finish Act 4 and see if we have any questions.
Okay, well, okay, well then let's move on. I just simply want to raise up two things. One is Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last. And the word there, the word phonon in that sense, may mean victory shout, and it may even be a reference to, like when the Apostle Paul says, "This is the voice of God, the voice of a God." That this is more than just a cry in pain or agony. This is a triumphant thing, and that's indicated because when the centurion sees Jesus and the way he breathed his last, that's when the centurion, and the only time in Mark's gospel when a human being in their right mind says, "This is God's son."
Yes.
The demons all the time knew who Jesus was, but only when they see him crucified
Yes.
and dead do people see who Jesus is.
Yes. Well, I strongly affirm everything you're saying there. And I especially like the way that you translated verse 39. Many translations will say, when they saw that he thus breathed his last, or something. The RSV says this. The point is that it's the way he breathed his last. That he breathed it for all of his suffering, he breathed it as a victory. And it seems that there's a connection between what happens in the temple and Jesus' cry of victory. In other words, the tearing of the curtain seems to have a causal relationship to Jesus' cry. So that Jesus is affecting the tearing of the curtain.
Right, yes.
By his, and I think victory cry is the right thing. We're used to thinking of it a certain way, maybe from the movies. But I think you're right. It's a victory cry. The Roman centurion sees this and he says, "It really was the Son of God."
Yeah.
Who knew?
Who knew? Exactly. Right.
And you say it so well that it's only in seeing Jesus, the crucified one, that we understand what it means that he's the Son of God. Yeah. We can speak it truly.
Right. Yes. That's very important. We could go on. I would invite you to do some reflecting on your own on the last few verses of this chapter about Jesus's burial and the women who go to see him. It's interesting to note the same women who see him buried are the same women who go to the tomb, and they do that 3 times, and there's some interesting pieces about that. But let's take some questions from our studio audience or for those of you out in cyberspace.
I'll check the cyberspace.
Christopher.
That's a question.
So since we're going to be discussing the other three Gospels, the other two synoptic Gospels and then John, so this is our sort of swing at Mark. And I think, well, I guess most scholars believe Mark's Gospel is the first one.
Mhm.
And Woody made some references to Luke, some differences in Luke that's coming down the pike. I'm just wondering if you want to comment, in light of the fact that we're going to handle those other Gospels, on sort of what is the significance here of Mark, maybe as like a building block.
Well, I mean, certainly a whole lot of scholars do think Mark is the first, and that he's basing it on some sort of source that was told around there. But I've also been reading some scholarship recently that kind of reject the Mark coming first.
Shame on you.
Yeah. All right.
Well, I do hold to Mark being the first gospel written. You know, that's a whole a completely different thing to think about and to get into. It is true, and I'm only teasing the bishop here, but it is true that although it's the majority opinion, it's a pretty substantial majority opinion. It's not universal. There's not a complete consensus on the matter, and so there are reasons for thinking otherwise. But yes, so let's say that we work from the hypothesis that Mark is our earliest gospel. Then the kind of things that we're interested in moving on are there ways that you would see Matthew, for example, reshaping the story, changing the wording in certain places, making these kinds of interpretive adjustments that will bring certain things into focus that are less in focus in Mark.
Mhm.
Right. So I don't want to say that if another gospel follows the Gospel of Mark closely, that when they follow Mark, they don't really mean it, or it's not really their point of view. You don't want to say that, but it's interesting to see both what they include, what they exclude, and the kind of emendations that they make in service of the theological points that they want to make.
Right. Yes.
And it's perfectly coherent to make a claim about the general historical validity of the gospel narratives, while also understanding that each of them are told from a point of view, and exercise a kind of editorial latitude in order to make their points.
I think that's true, and I would certainly agree with Woody that I too think Mark is the first, and then the others build on it. But it has struck me as interesting to note the theological debate that's going on about that.
It never ends.
It never ends.
Some of us, our jobs depend on these debates. You know, they need to keep going. That's what employs us.
Well, there you go. Well, exactly.
So you need sinners. We need synoptic problems.
Okay.
Yes.
Very good. Any questions from out there in cyberspace, Mr. Dean? Or from our studio audience here?
Cyberspace is quiet today. Anybody else?
Cynthia.
I don't mean to confuse or go over the same what you said, oh my God, why have you forsaken me? And you explained it in these texts that Jesus on the cross is aware of his eternal mission, but it also has such a ring of humanity to it.
Absolutely.
And we can relate to that sense of forlornness, of abandonment.
Mhm.
Is it also that he is also being also of humanity, that he is aware of the cross that he is bearing for all of us at that time? But it has such an echo of being very real in an individual way.
Mhm. Yeah, I would certainly say so. I think the Mark in Jesus is clearly a very real human being, and his full humanity really shines through in this gospel, particularly in that sense of being abandoned.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. In fact, one of the reasons that I would be a little wary of a reading of Psalm 22 or the cry of dereliction that's too emotionally placid is that it can suggest that Jesus didn't find the crucifixion such a big deal, right? And the early church fought that heresy. The heresy was called Docetism, and the Docetism taught that Jesus was so divine that he only appeared or seemed to be human. but he didn't actually have human experiences. We don't believe that. We reject that. We call it a heresy. And so in it, as much as we exalt and believe in a divine Christ, second member of the Trinity, he's a divine human. I mean, he's a human who is divine, right? We affirm the full humanity of Christ. And thus, my argument would be that Jesus suffered on the cross a kind of agony that no other human being has known, but which draws into it and is related to every human agony ever suffered, because it surpasses all of them.
Indeed.
Well, thank you very much. And that concludes our session for this evening. Thank you, Professor Anderson. Thank you, Bishop Miller. We ask that you join us again next Thursday at 7 o'clock as we look at the Gospel of Matthew, and we will be joined by the Reverend Dr. Michael Cover, who is a professor at Marquette University, also in New Testament and early Judaism. So until next week.
We'll see you then. If you have questions that come up during the week, feel free to email us either through the All Saints Facebook page or through the Dawson website, bishop11@diomil.org. And thank you, Woody, for being with us. It was great fun.
Pleasure.
Peace.
Thank you.